First story. Dave Brown was sitting in a chair in his living room. Opposite his chair stood an empty couch, and between his chair and the sofa was a coffee table with 3 glasses of champagne. 1 full, 2 empty. A bottle of champagne sat in an ice bucket next to the table. Anyone watching him as he relaxed at 7:02 p.m. would have been a little concerned when he clearly said, "That's right, I hear her car in the driveway." But there were no observers. Dave was alone in the room. He continued to sit with a relaxed expression. When the front door opened, he couldn't be seen from where he was sitting, but he immediately heard his wife's voice. "Where are you, Dave?" "In the living room." Dave stood up abruptly as his wife entered the archway. She was holding the hand of a man 5 years younger than her, 49, thin, of average height, wearing a business suit. In her other hand, she held an orange A4 envelope. Dave, this is Michael." "Michael, this is my husband, Dave." Noticing that she was looking away and was generally nervous, Dave took 3 steps and warmly shook the intruder's hand. "I'm very glad to meet you, Michael. Do you mind if I call you Mike?" "Not at all, sir." "Can I offer you a glass of champagne?" "Please have a seat." Dave watched as 2 very embarrassed people sat down on the sofa and took the offered glasses after he filled them. "To your health. Now, could you tell this simple soul what's going on?" Deborah and Mike looked at each other. Mike nodded slightly and squeezed her hand. Dave, this isn't a very nice thing to talk about, so I'll just say it straight. Michael and I fell in love. I would like to get a divorce so we can get married." She stopped, expecting her husband's anger. She looked up from the floor to see Dave's expression. She didn't expect his face to remain neutral. Unconsciously, she moved a little closer to Mike. "Okay, Deb, are these divorce papers?" Deb looked up again, stunned. She had rehearsed this scene in her head many times, but never, not even in her wildest dreams, had it looked like this. She looked at Mike and tried to convey with her eyes, "I don't know what to say." He took the envelope from Deb and placed it on the table. "Yes, Dave, that's true. I think you will find them very reasonable. Deb doesn't ask you for anything other than her car. Included in the package is her statement of relinquishment of this house, your car, all your joint assets, and your retirement fund. Everything is signed and notarized on our part. I must warn you that I am a lawyer, and therefore everything is fine, but feel free to hire your own representative to put your mind at ease." "Well, I must say you are both very generous." Deb looked very excited, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "It was Mike's idea, Dave. In fact, he insisted. He said it's bad enough that he's stealing your wife without taking your hard-earned assets. This was not my motivation by any means, but Mike is quite rich even without your money. We will have more than you and I ever had." Maybe things would have been different if you had gotten a job after the kids were older and helped with the finances, Deb. Deb looked down again. So Mike asked, "Is your wife going to give a similar speech, or has she already received one?" "No, my wife died 8 years ago. I am a widower." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Really, thank you, Dave. It hurt like hell for a year or so, but time heals all wounds, as they say. Look, I really regret this, but I met Deb, and she was like the missing half of my soul. I didn't think I'd ever be full again. I wanted to tell you that I have been in love with your wife for several months now." "It's okay, Mike. I never hold a grudge. Please marry her with my blessing." Mike and Deb exchanged stunned glances. Deb, because it wasn't at all what she expected. Then she felt great relief. A few months ago, she made Michael believe that her marriage to Dave was over, that they tried to save it, but there was little hope. She knew that the weak point in her plan was Dave's reaction, which could make Mike realize that this was not entirely true. That's why she begged Mike to do it without confrontation. Mike insisted that real men solve problems head-on. He did not give in to persuasion. Mike was stunned because even after Deb told him that her marriage was on its last legs, he expected a more angry reaction from Deb's descriptions. He formed a mental image of Dave from what she said. He was a large, uneducated man who was used to solving problems with his fists. Mike toyed with the idea of bringing a bodyguard with him tonight, but eventually dismissed the idea. In the depths of his soul, he thought that if the offended husband hit him a little, it might ease his own conscience. His own sense of decency weighed on him. "So, Deb, I assume you met Mike at one of your girls' parties." Deb nodded toward the coffee table. "One of those girls' nights out that you assured me was completely harmless and didn't threaten our marriage when I asked." This time, Deb nodded toward the floor. "I think this is a lesson for you, Mikey boy." Mike looked at Deb. Deb's gaze moved to an area of the floor a little further away from Mike. "So what happens to people now? Come on, Deb, you have to have a plan. You're giving me the house, so I'm guessing you were going to pack up your things and move in with him. I won't bother you. I was going to do this tomorrow, while you were at work. The locks will be changed by tomorrow. I'm sure your lawyer friend will agree that this is a wise move on my part. It's easier if you do it now, isn't it?" Deb and Mike stood up to go upstairs. "How about we talk, Mike? Deb can start packing." "Come on, Mike, let's chat. I think you owe me at least this." Deb was torn between wanting to avoid this truly awkward situation and having to bear witness to everything that was said. In the end, Mike made the decision for her, sitting back down. "Go, Deb. I promise not to hurt him. I just want to chat until we get divorced. I will feel responsible for your safety. I just want to make sure he has your best interests at heart. Besides, you made the decision to leave me. I don't see the point in trying to talk you out of it. Our marriage is obviously dead." Both men watched her walk up the stairs and disappear. "I must say you are very reasonable, Dave." "It's okay, Mike. Between you and me, I haven't felt Deb's love for about a year now. I guess that's when you met. It will indeed be a relief. I have no desire to condemn both of us to a loveless marriage." "That's still very nice of you, Dave." "You're welcome, Mike. Now, as a lawyer, you know that whenever you sell a car or house, you are legally obligated to point out any known defects to the new owners." Mike laughed. "Well, slavery is dead, and I don't think Deb would like being seen as property that needs to be transferred. But I see what you mean, Dave." Dave smiled too. He correctly guessed that Mike was an intelligent and decent person. "Okay, now please believe that what I'm about to tell you is not dictated by malicious intent. I just want to point out some of Deb's flaws that may not be obvious after a year of dating. Besides, her future happiness is important to me. After all, I've loved her for 27 years. I would also like to share everything that I tried to do to make her happy but obviously failed. This way, you will know not to waste your time on the same thing." Mike nodded. He knew that what was about to happen probably wouldn't be entirely altruistic in intent, but he felt he had an obligation to listen to this innocent man. "Right? I'm guessing Deb is back on the pills." Mike nodded again, feeling a little awkward. It was tantamount to admitting that he slept with this guy's wife. "Yes, she takes pills. I had no idea she ever stopped. She was on the pill when we met, but about 6 to 12 months after we got married, she came off it. She said they suppressed her sexual appetite. From then on, it was condoms for me. I can't stand these damn things. They take away all the spontaneity. And I don't know about you, but I struggle to get by without them." "Yes, I know what you mean, Dave." Then, when we decided to stop at 2 children, she started using condoms as an excuse not to make love as often. I begged her to go back on the pills, but she refused, saying she didn't want to swallow artificial chemicals every day. Since then, our lovemaking has dropped from several times a week to several times a month, then to 0 about a year ago. Mike didn't answer. He knew Deb was very careful about what food she ate and chose chemical-free options wherever possible. Sex with her was still exciting and happened at least 3 times a week, even with restrictions on their meetings. I know this is very ungentlemanly, Mike, but I want to know if my wife satisfies your sexual needs, because I was denied a lot of things, and then we stopped having sex completely until recently. I just got tired of getting knocked down and stopped asking. Maybe you'd like to write in your diary to keep track of any sudden lows every month or so." Dave paused so Mike could add something, but Mike didn't take the opportunity. And here's another thing that I noticed only a couple of years after our wedding. One day I looked around and suddenly realized that almost everything I owned before Deb was gone. A bed, clothes, a sofa, and photos of old girlfriends. Although, to be honest, I found them in the attic. I don't know if all women do this or if it's just Deb, but it was as if she wanted to clear the nest of previous female influences. Again, Dave paused, and again, Mike remained silent. He thought about his new bed and sheets. Then he remembered his conversation with Deb a week ago about the portrait of his first wife, the woman he loved dearly until circumstances cut her out of his life. "I hope you're better at spotting her lies than I am, Mike. Just 3 weeks ago, I asked if she still loved me and if things were good with us. She looked me straight in the eye and said yes. She did the same thing she always did, looked me in the eyes until I broke eye contact. I can't believe it only took 3 weeks to fall out of love so much." Mike reeled slightly from the surprise of this conversation and from all the information Dave was trying to force him to absorb. Something about those last 2 sentences was alarming, but he didn't have time to pinpoint the source. So he focused on the only aspect he could absorb. "Don't worry, Dave. I am a lawyer. I spent 20 years learning how to spot liars. They always give themselves away. Fine. Again, just some advice that you can take or not. Watch to see if she takes off her rings when she goes to visit her sister. You might want to check out her underwear drawer. I advise you not to trust her blindly, as I did. It seemed to me that she was completely incapable of deception, but obviously, I am stupid. What more can I say? Oh yeah, if she stays true to form, she'll probably stop going to the gym in about 6 to 12 months and gain some weight." At that moment, Dave stood up, took a photo album from the shelf, and began flipping through the pages. Here are a couple of photos from 2 years ago, when she started going to baccalaureate parties. As you can see, her face and ass are plump. But after 2 children, who would be surprised by this? Mike turned a few pages and saw a plumper version of his bride wearing much less makeup than he had ever seen. He was a little taken aback by the difference a little makeup made. He continued flipping through the pages. "Is this Deb's mother I see? A strong resemblance. Yes, it is. Wait a minute. As you can see, she was a beautiful woman. This is her when she was about 50. She was a very glamorous woman." Dave picked up another album and opened it to the page he expected Mike to say. "How old is she here?" "Around 55. Dave smiled and watched Mike alternately look at the 2 photographs. "And now I promise to tell you about all my mistakes because of which she could not love me. I suggest trying a different approach. Mine was clearly unsuccessful." Dave paused to pour the champagne. "About 25 years ago, she wanted a wedding. I tried to object, saying that we would be better off investing in a house, but she said that if I had faith that we would be together forever, then I would not save on such an important day for her. If you want, I can find you a copy of our wedding vows from memory. We adhere to the traditional love, honor, obedience, and abandonment of all others. If you try something different, you might end up doing better than me. Not really important to you, but don't bother working your fingers to the bone and doing a bunch of crap overtime so she can get the flash house she's always dreamed of." This clearly didn't deter her. "In fact, we're probably here because I refused to pay for the facelift she wanted, preferring to invest in our retirement. She can be quite persistent when her heart is set on something. You probably noticed." Mike nodded, wondering if this characteristic of Deb was truly the admirable quality he still believed in. "So I shouldn't have thought that I was acting smartly inviting her on a date every month to discuss everything that concerns me or our relationship which begins to irritate or causes the slightest indignation. Our last date was less than a month ago, and she didn't say anything. A man of your caliber, I'm sure, can come up with something better." At that moment, Mike noticed a twinkle in Dave's eyes and suddenly realized what he was up to. However, he made some good points. The idea of Deb being completely free of guile was very much at odds with some of his own thoughts of late. He was so taken aback by Dave's obvious amusement at the whole scenario that he again ignored the internal alarm. Dave continued to talk even though they both obviously knew Deb had stopped coming down the stairs once she was within earshot. "Keep an eye on the lists of things she plans to remove from the house. This is a good hint that she already disdains the marriage and is looking for a replacement. It won't change much about what happens, but it will allow you to prepare for the endgame she has planned and encourage you to start digging for more evidence." Mike blinked and looked around. For the first time, he saw 3 champagne glasses and an ice bucket, a clear indication that all 3 present knew about today's meeting in advance when there should have been only 2 of them. His usual highly observant nature missed the clues. Dave watched Mike's eyes dart. "Yes, I knew it would be today. Deb called me twice today to make sure I would be home by 7. Mike tore his eyes away from Dave and looked to where Deb was halfway down the stairs. Deb resumed her descent, clearly pretending that she had not heard the last minutes of the conversation. "Dave, do you want to talk about which family photo I can take now or some other time?" Dave ignored her and leaned towards the opposite couch, never taking his eyes off his rival. "The last thing I did wrong was forgive Deb when I first caught her cheating on our marriage," Dave admitted. "What? When?" Mike asked. "No," escaped Deborah's lips as she retreated into the kitchen. "Yes, it was right after the birth of our second child. I forgave her because she and our counselor convinced me that it was an isolated mistake caused by postpartum depression. I often wondered if I was too soft on her. Perhaps a tougher line at the time could have prevented a recurrence. I justified my actions by saying that I was acting in the best interests of the children. They grew up to be good people, so I hope I did right by them. For her sake, I hope that you will be generous enough to forgive her when your time comes." "I don't know what to say, Dave." "You don't have to say anything, Mike. Just answer me. Look into your heart and ask yourself if you would forgive your late wife if you found her as your lover in your own bed for the first time." Mike lost his composure. He leaned forward, and out of the corner of his eye, Dave noticed some movement and saw pale-faced Deborah standing in the kitchen doorway. "My wife would never show me such disrespect. We loved each other too much. Wait a minute, you said the first time Deb cheated on me. Were there other times?" "No, only twice, then and now." Deb ran out of the kitchen, screaming desperately, "I'm done packing. Mike, if you take my bags, we can get out of here right now." "Calm down, Deborah," Mike said. The last was said in a quiet but inexorable voice. Surprisingly, the voice belonged to Mike. Deb stopped in her tracks. "Mike, Deborah assured me that she didn't cheat because you had an open marriage," Dave said. "Did she look you in the eye when she talked about it?" Mike looked at Dave, then at the cowering Deb, then back at Dave. Dave saw in Mike's eyes the sudden realization that he wasn't as good at spotting liars as he thought. "What did she tell you about the state of our marriage, Mike?" "She said it's been shaking for a few years, Dave, that you had been seeing a psychologist for a while, but neither of you had any hope." Dave didn't answer, just stared at Mike as he continued talking to fill the void. "Now, I think that doesn't really fit with what you were saying about still going on dates and asking if she loved you." Dave continued to look into Mike's eyes. Again, he chose the exact moment when Mike realized that he had been played like a complete sucker. An expression that could easily be interpreted as self-loathing flashed across the little man's face. Mike turned to the frozen Deborah. "You're a Dan. You have turned me into the person I despise most. A man who sleeps with other people's wives without their husband's knowledge." Hearing this statement, Deb dropped to her knees. Mike was suddenly speechless and interested in the same patch of carpet that had so fascinated Deb before. Finally, he pulled himself together and looked at Dave again. "Please, Dave, You have to believe me. I had no idea. Don't worry, Mike, Dave said. I told you she's a good liar. God, I wish she had told me that we have an open marriage. Then I might have gotten laid last year. The deliberate use of humor in a very tense situation seemed to work. Mike relaxed a little but remained silent. Does this mean that the engagement is broken? Yes, definitely. In that case, I want to introduce you to a couple of people, John and Alice. At that moment, the door to the basement opened. Hearing the noise, Mike turned around and saw a young man and a woman approaching. Mike, I want to introduce you to my son John and daughter Alice. They listened to our conversation through a microphone. John graduated from law school 2 years ago, and Alice received her degree this year. John and Alice shook hands with a confused Mike. John then took the envelope from the table and began to dispassionately examine its contents. Dave turned to his daughter. Do you believe me now, Alice? Yes, Dad. Alice replied. There is no doubt that she is a cold, cunning schemer. All eyes turned to the groaning Deb, who was still kneeling, but her head was now on the floor. Feeling the silence, she raised her head and met 4 accusing gazes. She jumped up and ran out the front door. No one made the slightest attempt to stop or follow her. John calmly finished looking through the contents of the envelope. Everything seems okay, Dad. Okay, thank you. Now, who wants a beer? This fizzy cat pee is good, but I need beer to get rid of the taste in my mouth. I think I have to go, Mike said. Stay here, little Mikey. We still need to figure something out. For example, well, I can forgive you for sleeping with that stupid Mike. She has an open marriage and all. But I have to decide whether to rip your head off and spit on your neck for trying to steal her, Dave said. Mike looked at the other man, noting that he was a head taller and much larger. Then he looked into Dave's eyes and saw the already familiar shine. Dave, have you ever thought about a career in law? The way you threw me off balance, passing off negatives as positives, and not giving me time to think was worthy of the best prosecutor I've ever seen. Dave smiled modestly but said nothing. He loved his job and the people who surrounded him at work. So, for beers? For the first time ever, Dave looked away until he was sure that the tears that had accumulated in the corners of his eyes had disappeared. He would no longer look into his eyes. By this time, Deb Brown was already 700 meters away. She was walking quickly and accelerating as if her heels were on fire. In this situation, of course, I feel sorry for the children who will eventually understand everything. But is the woman right? Write in the comments. Second story. My name is James. I want to tell you about the time when I met my first love. It all started back in my childhood. It so happened that I was born in a small provincial town where all the neighbors knew each other, so my parents often let me play on the local playground because strangers usually did not hang around. I had many friends, but Lisa held a special place in my heart. We had a lot of hobbies in common, like reading comic books and collecting different toy figurines. I always had fun with her, and soon these feelings started to grow into something more. Even in school, we were in the same class and sat at the same desk. Of course, from time to time, all sorts of disagreements arose between us. At those moments, we would fight or ignore each other. After a while, however, we would get bored and rekindle our friendship. When high school started, we started dating. And this decision was not spontaneous, because I had already been actively courting Lisa for several years. She looked very attractive, so many boys tried to arouse her interest. But I nipped it in the bud because no one could start communicating with her so easily. I was too jealous, and I couldn't let that happen. As it turned out, her feelings were mutual. We liked each other, so there was nothing stopping us. Soon after school, we decided to get married. Of course, such an initiative strained our parents since we were young. Some members of the family suspected that Lisa was pregnant, but that wasn't true because there was no way I would have done that to her. And then we stood at the altar. The priest asked, "Are you ready to be together for better or for worse? Please answer, bride." Yes, answered Lisa. Then the priest turned to me. Please answer you, bridegroom. Yes. And so began one of the happiest stages of our lives. We were finally married. Our life was stable. In spite of the fact that in the beginning we could afford only a modest rented apartment, a few years later we managed to buy our first property together. Gradually, I set up a modest business. To be more specific, I managed to open a small restaurant with European cuisine in our town. It was called Elisa directly after my wife, because it was our joint contribution. I dealt with the organizational aspects and my wife took care of the design of the place. After a couple of years, the little restaurant started to flourish. On weekends, there was a real full house. There were not enough empty seats in the restaurant. So it's not surprising that in the future, we were able to open a whole chain of such establishments. Elisa became a real brand. We could afford the luxury life. We spent several months a year traveling abroad, visiting various cultural events and exhibitions. We looked for inspiration for our restaurant. But at the age of 30, there came that stage in life when we decided to think about having children. A little quarreling began as I wanted to be a father of many children. Lisa didn't support the idea and tried to convince me to have just one child. We agreed that we would revisit the issue after the birth of our first child. It was a big, healthy boy named Danny. Parenthood didn't seem very difficult for us, since we could afford a babysitter, au pair, and so on. Lisa didn't need to clean other people's diapers, so she got bored very quickly. James? Yes. We need another baby after all, she said. I was pleasantly surprised. Wouldn't it be 3 at once? Lisa looked at me carefully and then nodded affirmatively. 5 years later, there were 6 of us. In addition to the older Danny, Chloe, Jenna, and Sean came along as well. That's when we realized it wasn't going to be easy anymore. Parenthood was starting to weigh on me, but I didn't give up. Somebody had to support my dear wife. It wasn't until my youngest son turned 16 that we could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The kids were grown, which meant they didn't demand as much of our attention. On the contrary, they were trying to separate themselves from us. James, can I talk to you for a minute? My wife came to me one day. Yes, honey. Our neighbor wants us to have a little party on Sunday. What's the occasion? The envelope said they wanted to celebrate the prosperity of their business. If you remember, they have several florist boutiques in town. I wondered, does that mean it will be like a wedding there? What do you mean, James? When we were there were pots of ficus and sansevieria all over the place. I'm afraid to imagine what their house looks like for the holidays. Lisa laughed very loudly. I loved her tinkling and pleasant laugh. I'm sure it will be very nice. I don't like flowers, I admitted. Of course, with a sly smile, said Lisa. You think I did not notice that in the past 2 months you did not once give me flowers? I smiled politely at her hint, and then left the room to order by courier a lush bouquet of red roses. It was Lisa's favorite color. A week later, we went to a party. Refusing the invitation was awkward, so we simply had no choice. When we walked onto our neighbor's property, we immediately noticed that the entire yard was strewn with flowers. There were peonies, rose bushes, and other plants growing in the yard that I didn't have much sympathy for. It was no better inside. There were buds and fresh flower petals everywhere. Small groups of wasps flocked to the sweet smell since it was summertime, but the guests were not too worried about that as the incredible floral arrangements attracted too much attention. We were greeted by our hosts. James, Lisa, I am so glad you answered my invitation, the neighbor said excitedly. She and I were on very good terms, so she was glad we came. And how glad we are, Daphne, replied Lisa. I hope you like everything, asked the neighbor interestedly. You could see in her eyes that she was waiting for the praise and enthusiasm from our lips. Of course, we couldn't upset her. It's just unbelievable, I said. I think so too, my wife echoed my words. It's like we're in paradise. It is so beautiful here, and the flowers smell so. It's gorgeous. Did you and Donald choose the design together? Daphne blushed awkwardly. We divorced Donald a month ago. Oh, in one voice, my wife, and I let out a polite gasp of surprise, although there was nothing strange about this situation, since Daphne regularly married someone and then divorced within a couple of months. Unfortunately, some people have no luck at all in love. Thanks to this, however, my wife and I are once again convinced that our marriage is the most precious treasure it could be. Daphne deftly interrupted the silence. But that's no trouble at all, for I married Greg. Greg? I asked again. Our neighbors seem to change men like gloves. Yes. I'll introduce you. Our neighbors seem to change men like gloves. Greg, come here. I'll introduce you to my friends. A pleasant-looking man who looked about a decade and a half younger than Daphne came up to us. His tan skin resembled something like a melted bar of chocolate. He walked leisurely toward us as his curly hair fell carelessly over his shoulders. He was just adorable. Even I had to admit it. Displaying his charming smile, he shook my palm, and then kissed Lisa's hand. My name is Greg. It's a pleasure to meet you. So did we, my wife answered sweetly. I helped Daphne pick out the floral decorations. I hope you will remember today for a long time to come. After that, Greg went off to meet the other guests. What do you think of him? Daphne asked slyly. He is so young, Lisa said. Of course he is. That's what interested me. Despite my dislike of flowers, the party was worthwhile. We got to drink a few glasses of champagne and discuss the life of our neighborhood with our rich neighbors. Everything was just charming. However, there's always a little annoyance. My wife was careless and accidentally palmed a wasp. Lisa groaned loudly, and I noticed a reddened bite on her arm. Daphne reacted to the noise and quickly approached us so that we wouldn't frighten the other guests with the situation. Oh, that damn wasp. I'm sorry, Lisa. It's warm today, so we couldn't keep the windows closed, Daphne said pitifully. Greg came over to us and took my wife's hand. The gesture made me feel dubious, but I decided to ignore it. Lisa, you need to remove the sting from the wound immediately or your hand will swell even more. Let's go to the bathroom, and I'll help you. Yes. All right, my wife said frustratedly. I followed them into the bathroom, but Greg stopped me. Don't worry. I'll clean it up quickly and get your wife back. The bathroom is small, so you won't fit, the young man said with a smile. Good, I understand. In that case, I'll wait. In about half an hour, my wife returned to me with a bandaged hand. Our stay was spoiled by this incident, so at the first opportunity, we decided to leave. How so? We're still going to have fun tonight, said Daphne sadly. Lisa's not feeling very well right now. Her palm hurts, so we'll leave early. Whatever. We left. By the next day, the swelling on her hand was almost completely gone. Lisa continued to do her daily activities, that is, to look after her youngest son. I, of course, worked during this time. When I returned from work the day after the party, I managed to catch my wife on the phone. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you very much. I am very pleased. As soon as Lisa noticed me, she immediately said goodbye to her companion and hung up. My wife began to smile at me amiably. Somebody called. Yes, Greg called me to ask about my arm. I wondered, why didn't Daphne do it? My wife thought for a while, and then answered my question. Daphne called first. She and I discussed my hand, and she felt guilty. Then she put Greg on the phone because he was worried too. The situation puzzled me a bit. I couldn't understand why the neighbor's husband was worried about my wife's health. I see. Then I'll go upstairs, Lisa. Good. I went upstairs to the bedroom and thought about the situation for a long time. But it wasn't right to beat myself up with my thoughts, so I decided to ignore Greg's prank. And just as I had forgotten about the situation, 2 days later I noticed this guy at our house. It was very strange to see someone I hadn't invited. Lisa was kindly chatting with Greg in the living room. I was on my way back from work that day. Oh, James, We were just discussing something important, exclaimed Lisa. Yes. What is it? Greg greeted me politely and offered to shake my hand. I started to fidget but finally squeezed his hand. Greg and I were discussing that we could use the new decorations at the restaurant. I see. I was surprised to hear about this for the first time. There was a sense of resentment that Lisa had chosen to discuss it with an outsider and not with me. In that case, I don't want to distract you. I'm very tired after work, so I'll go. Okay, my loves, said Lisa kindly. From then on, Greg came into my life more and more often. My wife was constantly talking to him on the phone, going to visit him on her own, and doing other incomprehensible things. The motivation for her actions was inexplicable to me. I suspected treason on her part. And it turned out to be true. One day I noticed them cuddling in our bathroom. Luckily, they didn't notice me. I was too angry and annoyed too, but I could contain myself. I wanted revenge that day. And I decided that sooner or later it would happen. The important thing was to wait for the right moment. A month later, Daphne threw another party, but it was for Greg's birthday. Of course, my wife and I were the invited guests. The evening was great except for a few moments. Lisa felt that I had become too cold to her lately, and instead of reconnecting with me, she decided to distance herself from me as well. You could say that our dislike was mutual. My wife and I were talking to the other guests. James, how's your business going? It's going pretty well. We're thinking of expanding again. I'm going to buy a little piece of land by the waterfront to add my restaurant to it. Wow, Daphne's friend exclaimed. Your family is slowly taking things to the next level. James, I'm going to go powder my nose, said Lisa, and then headed toward the restroom. I started to keep a close eye on Greg, who was in the opposite corner of the room. 10 seconds later, he headed toward the restroom too. It was just the right moment. Daphne, can I talk to you for a minute? I called to my neighbor. She quickly came over to me. How do you like tonight, James? It's great, but I need to show you something. My neighbor looked at me in surprise. I could tell from her eyes that she was confused. I told her to follow me. We made our way toward the bathroom. It took one long hallway to get there. James, I don't like this. I pointed my finger at her to keep her quiet. As we approached the restroom, small moans began to be heard. With frightened eyes, Daphne watched me. I turned to her. I'm sorry. I promise I'll pay you for the door. What? Before Daphne knew it, I had my shoulder on the door. The lock snapped and bounced the other way. At first, the neighbor was very angry, but then her expression changed dramatically. Standing inside were a half-dressed Greg and Lisa. Everyone was surprised at this situation except me. I knew what was going to happen next. Daphne is a girl with a difficult temper, as evidenced by her numerous weddings and divorces. She was very hot-tempered, so I wasn't surprised when my wife was dragged by her hair into the living room. Lisa looked at me with pleading eyes, but I showed complete indifference. All the guests watched in amazement as Daphne punched and shoved my wife. I enjoyed watching the spectacle. At the end, when my wife was pushed out of the house after all, it was Greg's turn. It wasn't that interesting to watch, so I left. As it turned out later, Lisa was very offended by my action. This situation seemed like a betrayal to her. I didn't argue with that. The following week we divorced. I didn't want to kick her out of the house, so I left on my own. And my life was very interesting. I went over to Daphne's house a couple of times because I felt guilty about the little furor I had managed to cause. Of course, my neighbor forgave me. More to the point, after all that had happened, we decided to get married. My ex-wife hated me for such an act. But I no longer cared because it was my turn to play with someone else's feelings.